All right, and I will talk as fast as I possibly can because the conversation is always more interesting than the talk. So what I wanted to do very quickly was not focus entirely on the genome editing report, but to talk about what I think has been a kind of under-noticed phenomenon, which is that we've been talking about the same issues for 45 years, but we've never actually looked to see whether or not all of the fears we claim are on the horizon actually come about. I think what's happened is that, unbeknownst to all of us, we have in fact begun to de-romanticize genetics, but we still argue as if we haven't. We are, as we all know here in this room, very diverse genetically. I always love this, we are all mutants kind of notion, but it helps to point out that in some ways there's nothing sacred about my particular compilation of genetic traits, because everybody has an interesting compilation filled with advantages and disadvantages situationally expressed. And yet we still have this recurring problem where people kind of imagine that they themselves are somehow defined by their genes. There's going to be a conference next week in Philadelphia, which is entirely about the degree to which genes define your, quote, personal identity, unquote, which kind of appalled me when I got invited to speak, because I thought, my God, that should have been answered long ago, but apparently it is not. So I wanted to just run through some of the ways in which this has been expressed and then end with the genome editing report, which did, as he said, come out on Valentine's Day, and which, as a bottom line, truly de-romanticized genetics to the extent that we said it is ethically permissible, when safe enough and carried out properly, to consider editing the human the human germline in a way that is heritable across generations. It was kind of the last barrier to be crossed, and this report, for better or worse, said when safe enough and done properly and for a good enough reason, it's a barrier that can be crossed without violating some ethical norms in our view. So most of us are familiar with genetics primarily in the sense of, kind of prognostication, what will happen to me, and we have years of either family histories, this is Huntington's on the lower left, and then the more modern path to personalized medicine that came out from the FDA about pharmacogenomics. But less noticed, although certainly not unknown in this room, are the ways in which we look at identity in terms of things like sex. This is something that's been going on now for decades in the Olympics, where women were being asked to prove that they were really women, and where it really became a very interesting question about what it is that defines femaleness for the purpose of sports. We had XY women who were androgen insensitive. Their bodies developed entirely like female bodies, but they had a Y chromosome. Did that make them male? For a long time it did. Now the most recent case has to do with somebody who was XX, but her body naturally produced higher levels of testosterone than is typical for XS women. And so she was going to be dismissed from the Olympics for having too much testosterone. Not because she was naturally taller or naturally faster or naturally had better aerobic capacity, but because she had too much testosterone. So we're still struggling with this kind of genetics versus other aspects of physiology as category defining. We all know that race and ethnicity has been the subject of years of discussion about the role of genetics. This particular slide's a little hard to see, I apologize for that, but these people are all wearing t-shirts where they have the various census years and what category they were in, so you can see how their categories changed, not because they changed, but because of the way in which the categories were being drawn, so that somebody might have started out as black and then become Hispanic and then become white or black again. It's also been used, and this is increasingly popular now, for this kind of notion of who are my people, what group do I belong to. DNA, 23andMe and DNA Ancestry are now selling kits so that you can learn more about yourself. My favorite ad on TV is the one where the guy starts changing from his Scots tartans to his Munich, lederhosen, because the DNA apparently tells him that he's more Austrian or German than he is Scottish. And I'm like, really? Do you really care that much? I mean, don't you know that tartan looks better than the lederhosen? And yet there was this sense that biologically this linkage was important. And we actually see that it's not just emotional, but it's legal. So in Hawaii, for example, we now recently have seen a development, this is only about a year and a half old, where DNA testing is being used to determine who was Hawaiian enough to qualify for various programs that, since Hawaii was taken over by the United States, have had certain kinds of land trusts or school admissions or other programs reserved for, quote unquote, native Hawaiians who had to have at least 50% Hawaiian ancestry. Now, this meant that they had to decide what was Hawaiian DNA and then have a list of that and then know what they were testing for. But the interesting thing is that the same kind of issue came up, but with different results, in the mainland with Native American tribes. Because, of course, there too there's a lot of interest in genetic ancestry. But there was a very interesting debate within the tribes about whether your membership had to do with your blood background, that is, your DNA history, or whether your membership was really a political issue, so that you were a member of the tribe if you were a citizen of the tribe, which meant that you had to be voted a citizen or granted citizenship by some rule. Just like here in the US, you're born here or you're born abroad to American parents, you're automatically a citizen. Under some circumstances, you can lose or relinquish your citizenship, you can be naturalized. So for some tribes, as a statement of their political status, not relinquishing sovereignty as a nation, from their point of view, blood was not the issue. The issue was whether or not you were born to somebody who was a member of the tribe or whether or not you'd been naturalized into the tribe. And it wasn't about DNA. Other tribes still kept a more kind of ethnically focused definition, and it really highlighted not only the lack of importance of DNA for some people, but also the implicit kind of statement it made about what kind of people you are, an ethnic group or a political subdivision that can still argue for certain rights. In this realm of who are my family, too, it's not just recent. Of course, it's long been the case that we've ignored genetics when we thought that it was important for other purposes. The Romans used adoption to ensure property transfer across generations. Jane Austen's brother, Edward Knight, was actually adopted into a wealthier family and raised to be the heir of that family, which was good because when her family was destitute, basically, because her father was a minister or a parson, she had a place to go. The 19th and 20th century in the United States, adoptions were basically ways for free labor to be transferred to people. This is the whole Anne of Green Gables story up in Canada. But slowly, the reformers decided the best interest of children was to live with a natural family. They created the closed adoptions. Everybody acted as if you were the genetic offspring. In fact, birth parents were fictionally made to disappear, as if they never existed. Birth certificates were rewritten. And it took until the late 20th and early 21st century to move back to the idea that, your family is something that is a social construct as well as a biological construct, and it doesn't have to be the same all the time for all purposes. So that legally speaking, your family may be those that the law recognizes, genetic or legal, whereas for, let's say, family medical history tracing, you want to know who are the people whose chromosomes contributed to yours, and that different categories make sense under different contexts. We also see in the world of artificial insemination a willingness to back away from this kind of focus on genetics and family, because whereas it started, well, actually, this is the first of what will be probably some very quick little asides. I like the fact that it started with Henry IV, King of Castile, nicknamed Henry the Impotent. History is a wonderful thing. But really, when it first began to be used with donor semen, the big issues were adultery. Does it mean the woman has essentially had sex with this donor? And illegitimacy. But over time, both in English law and in American law, rules about parentage began to focus really on who was the father in place, or at least theoretically in place. That was the old English law. If the husband of the wife had been within any of the 7 seas at the time that the conception might possibly have taken place, he was deemed to be the legal father regardless. And the variations in the US were on things like what presumption, rebuttable or non-rebuttable, you give to that paternity. And so sperm donation really began to grow. I just happen to love this. This is from the UK. I love the idea for certain. Yes. Take a moment and laugh.
There's no hair on it.
And then you can enjoy this one too. But now back to the more serious stuff. The second half of the 20th century was where we began to see in sperm donation this rise of sperm banks with catalogs. And I started my career in science policy at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, and having done the tour of California sperm banks at one point, came back with catalogs, which we posted, and everybody got to pick which person they would have as their donor, right? And we all got to see what our preferences were. And so, not surprisingly, it began to be the subject of lots of literature, which you're all familiar with, about the effect of commercialization and the commodification of characteristics. So we have the sperm bank turns away carrot tops. I can tell you back in the late 80s already, they were turning away, at the California Cryobank in Hollywood, they were turning away men whose height did not at least reach 5'10", because so few women were choosing those guys from the catalogs. And it was purely a business decision, right? So 5'9" male was not commercially valuable. You might be emotionally valuable, but not commercially. And so we had, starting very early, although this one is a quote from a more recent paper, this kind of concern that we were commodifying children and commodifying our attitude about children, and we would develop expectations about them, and we would reject the ones that were imperfect, and we were treating them as products. You recognize all of this rhetoric, right? And the reason I picked this one out for 2013 is that from the 1980s and sperm donation to 2013, so a 30-year spread, you could have taken this article and you could have written it 30 years earlier. It would sound identical, right? Same concerns, same claims, including the one that it's not so terrible that you're doing this for your own child because you want to give them a better life. It's that it's part of a trend that will slowly kind of corrupt society and erode our attitudes about the giftedness of children. So keep that in mind. One of the heights of the fears, of course, was the genius, so-called genius sperm bank that had only one so-called genius, one Nobel Prize winner. The rest were mostly graduate students and assistant professors. Most people have heard me talk about this because I think I'm the only congressionally sponsored person who toured the genius sperm bank. But this optometrist over here, Robert Clark Graham, would basically listen to the radio or watch TV, and he'd identify guys that sounded smart, and he'd write to them and say, do you want to donate? That was it. And when I asked him how he figured out which ones were smart, he said, well, he always picked people from the math and physical sciences, and quote, because with the social sciences and humanities, you never really know. This guy generated reams of articles and newspaper articles and magazine covers about the kind of commodification of our ability to select children and perfect our children. And yet how many so-called geniuses were ever really born? And the answer is under 100. Because even with this available semen, which was, by the way, free, and it was free to any woman regardless of whether she was a genius or not. That was the debate between him and his partner that caused a split. Women didn't flock to this. Now, I will grant you that if it had been an athletic star bank, we might have had a different result, right? Because Americans are kind of anti-intellectual. But the point is simply that the fears that had been raised were never realized, and yet you don't see articles about how the fears were never realized. And people didn't commodify their children, and they didn't try to perfect their children. Instead, people who get donated sperm, if they are married, tend to want to find a donor who resembles their partner. Because to do anything other than that is, number one, to highlight the fact that this is not a genetically related child, which some people still would prefer to keep private, and also creates this kind of underlying implicit discussion with your partner about whether or not you find your partner wanting, right? And granted, intellectually, we all know that my mother, if she'd written down a list of characteristics, would not have said, I want a man who's incredibly short, tending toward baldness and a pot belly. But she fell in love with somebody like that, and I don't think she would have traded him in. But if she had picked somebody who didn't have those traits, would it have changed the dynamic in the relationship? Which is why we did not see the kinds of fears people mentioned realized with this perfectibility of children. Now, that's not to say there isn't some degree of selection going on. I'm particularly fond of this, a little hard to say on the far right, those are little sperm with Viking horns. And it's because in the UK, where sperm donation is open donation, so there's no anonymity anymore, women have started going outside the country if they wanted anonymous donors who would not pose any kind of emotional or legal claim on the offspring. And a lot of them came from Denmark. So it was this kind of classic preference in the Caucasian population for tall, pale, blonde, etc. And so they called it the Danish invasion. I love, the Daily Mail, which is, of course, a very reputable paper. Right, talking about how it's, they invaded us once by boat and now they're doing it with sperm. I mean, you can't make up headlines like this. So there's certainly some degree of commercialization, but it's not the kind of gross commodification of children that we talked about, nor is it turning out to be as harmful to children as people feared. Basically, just like with adoption, if you tell kids early enough on, it normalizes it for them, and they tend to have no remarkable levels of emotional difficulty as adults. Tell them when they're adults and they are now kind of shocked by their origins, and it tends to have different kinds of repercussions. Test tube babies, IVF, right? Here are all the kinds of, crazy, covers and fears. And immediately, as soon as IVF comes on the scene, we start again talking about commodification and whether or not we'll love her. This is from the Life magazine, and I pulled it out because you can't see it otherwise. Will children and parents still love each other? But think back. I mean, a lot of people in this room are looking around how many people are dyeing their hair or could be dyeing their hair, and we remember this. I'm speaking for myself. And for those of you that can't remember it, trust me, this was everywhere. This fear that somehow we were fundamentally altering the very nature of families to the point where we would not feel bonded to one another. We would somehow be bonded to the test tube or to the doctor or to the lab, right? And yet even here, pretty quickly, we began to realize how confused it was. So we had both egg donation, where the egg donor, who was the genetic mother, was supposed to then disappear, or we had gestational surrogacy, in which now the person who provided the egg was the real mother, and it was the gestational surrogate who was the carrier was supposed to disappear. And so it wound its way through the courts and got to the point here in California, at least, with the kind of seminal Johnson case, that we really began to see that neither one of these attributes, which were both part of biological motherhood, were truly determinative of parentage, and we needed to begin taking a look at intention in some capacity. Whether it was a tiebreaker or in and of itself was determinative, varied from state to state. But we began to realize that genetics didn't have to be the end-all and be-all. In the absence of genetics or the manipulation of genetic traits didn't mean that we had to stop loving our children. Next, what will happen to my children? This is another familiar area. It was all about the various eras of testing, right? The amnio, the CVS, what Hank's written a lot about and worked a lot about, having to do with the non-invasive testing, and then, of course, PGD, where, again, there was this kind of hysteria about whether or not we're going to start selecting for trivial traits. And once again, we're going to start rejecting as imperfect products children that have curly hair instead of straight, brown eyes instead of blue, whatever it is, right? And let's take a look at what really happened then. So selection is something that's been around since the 1970s for Down syndrome. This was my job in high school, was karyotyping in a genetics lab at Downstate Medical Center. And the first time I ever did a karyotype and discovered that there was an extra chromosome and realized what that meant for this pregnancy, I can still remember where I was standing and how I was feeling. As at the time, you would photograph the chromosomes and cut them out with a scissor and line them up on paper, and tape them to the paper. Well, you realized you had an odd number, and you started looking around the desk, desperately hoping that there was one that you had dropped, right? So what's happened? Interestingly, for people who choose to actually find out, 3/4 of them will, in fact, abort a fetus that is going to result in a child with Downs, even knowing that Downs presents at many levels of severity. And in many levels of severity that are not quite as profound can be part of a very happy, sometimes even happier life. But that's been understood by many people to suggest that we're basically aborting pretty much all the Downs babies without remembering a lot of people deliberately choose not to know. So the data suggests that, in fact, even with all of this pervasive testing, all of it, amnio and CVS and PGD and selective abortion, all of these options, that the reduction is only about 30% in the number of children born with Downs. Again, telling you, yes, these are real things. It wasn't like people were making up the possibility that selection would actually lead to a distaste for people with certain disabilities, but it's also not the wholesale kind of genocide of people with disabilities that had been imagined when these techniques came into play. The other kind of objection that was being raised all the time was the idea this was playing God. You've all heard that phrase. One of my favorite books ever is Mendel's Dwarf. I highly recommend it for your classes, but you have to remember the book is filled with vulgarity, so it poses a challenge for undergraduates in particular. But this Benedict Lambert is an achondroplastic dwarf, hereditary dwarf, and he's looking at a collection of frozen embryos, and some of them he knows now have the trait for dwarfism, and some have the trait for typical height. And he's deciding what to do. And he has the option. He could decide he wants to implant only the ones that are going to be dwarfs so he has a kid like him. Kind of a statement of his own personal worth. Only implant the ones for kids that lack that trait because you want to do best for your kid, and in this world it's a lot easier to not be a dwarf than to be one, not only because of the social issues but because of all the health problems that go along with it. But interestingly, this idea that selecting is playing God is rejected by him, and what he says instead is, you could select normal, you could select the achondroplastic, or you could refuse to usurp the powers of God and become as helpless as he and leave the result to blind and careless chance. Because, of course, that is what happens in nature, which is that it's statistical odds. So unless one has a notion about God equaling fate, where everything is predetermined, and some religious ideologies do, It's a kind of it's kind of reversing on its head this notion about what playing God means. It's not about taking action. Playing God means taking no action and letting things just happen. And taking action would be more like playing human. Now, the concerns about disability were very profound. Are we going to now lose respect for people who have disabilities? And it's, again, worth noting that in all these years, with all these new selection techniques, pre-implantation, preconception, prenatal, you name it, all of these things were increasing in their availability, prices were lowering, the normalization of this as medical practice, at the same time that we saw an improvement in the legal status of people with disabilities and their entitlement to services and facilities that let them participate in the world completely. I am not foolish enough to say that there's an easy causal relationship back and forth here. Maybe these laws would have been enacted earlier or have been better if we didn't have these selection techniques. So I can't say that these selection techniques didn't somehow harm people with disabilities. But it should at least cause us to rock back on our heels a little and ask, we've been talking for years about playing God. Well, Simon Moyer had an answer to that. We've been talking for years about commodification. No evidence that I can find that we've actually started treating our children badly because of the ability to select, and not any clear evidence to me that the availability of these techniques has led to a worsening of the condition in life of people with disabilities, at least in the United States. Next, selection viewed as kind of genetic engineering. This is a common confusion where people imagine if you could select for things, you were designing things. They're obviously not the same thing. And nonetheless, it did result from the very earliest eras in this kind of conflation of selecting to designing. So this is one of these early, like early 1980s things, which was really about a person can now pick a kid's sex and screen for genetic illness. Will they someday select for brains and beauty too, right? And again, the illustrations are priceless. So before the genome editing report, I served on a committee that was chaired by Jeff Kahn from Hopkins on mitochondrial DNA disease. And it was to look at a technique called mitochondrial replacement. Mitochondrial disease is something that is poorly understood by the general population. In its most severe forms, it can be lethal. It can certainly be debilitating. But it's very frustratingly unpredictable. Mitochondria are transferred through the egg, but they're not in the nucleus, as you know from your cell biology. And so there's a lot of complicated calculation about how many of the mutant mitochondria from a mother's eggs will actually wind up in the fertilized egg or in the cells that then divide, because each division and each transfer of mitochondria has its own little choke points and complications. And for that reason, a lot of the techniques we're used to seeing don't necessarily work. You can't really screen through PGD, for example, and have a good idea about what kind of prognosis you have with mitochondrial disease. One cell from the embryo might be fairly free of mutant mitochondria, but the others you didn't test might be filled with mutants. So it's a complicated disease to deal with. The other thing that's interesting about it is that since the mitochondria pass through the egg, it's only heritable if you have female offspring. If you have male offspring after mitochondrial replacement using healthy donor mitochondria put into the egg with the nuclear DNA of the woman who plans to be the mother, and then only have male offspring, the change will be affected for that offspring, but not for any future descendants. So our committee, unlike the United Kingdom, which looked at the same issue, had decided that for the moment, the way to tackle something this big is to start with a non-heritable form of germline modification. That is, you can modify the eggs with by replacing them with new and presumably unmutated mitochondria, but don't make it heritable. Now, there were lots of arguments back and forth, and I know that Hank, for example, is somebody who might have a strong disagreement on this. And our UK colleagues have argued back and forth with us as well. But to be fair, one of the other things going on is that we knew in the background that nuclear DNA engineering was coming down the path. And we didn't want to write a report that essentially jumped out ahead of some other activity that was still developing over a related area of engineering that clearly would be heritable under all circumstances. With mitochondria, we made the first kind of attempt to say it's okay to cross the germline barrier, but not in a heritable fashion. That's not to say, by the way, it didn't raise some concerns, because, of course, whereas we think of nuclear DNA being all about like what you look like and whether or not you resemble your parents, when you think about ancestry testing, a lot of that is actually through the maternal line, through mitochondria. So now we had this lovely disconnect. My family's determined by my nuclear DNA, but my ancestry is determined by my mitochondrial DNA, and those two might not be the same. in any one person. So I'm not saying these things are unproblematic, simply that we are beginning to unpack the degree to which we think that any aspect of genetics is somehow determinative in a way that I think of as being almost romanticizing its importance in our lives. And that importance, and I'm getting very close to the end, that importance really is manifest, I think, in the Oviedo. Is it Oviedo or Oviedo? Somebody here know? Oviedo? Thank you. I've never been sure how to pronounce it. Convention, which has been signed on to by about 25 countries or so, although not always adopted into domestic law yet, primarily in Europe, not always. And it basically says you can modify the genome for therapeutic purposes, but you absolutely are not allowed to introduce any modification in the genome of any descendants, right? Well, that raised very quickly the question of whether or not we really agree with this. And so with CRISPR-Cas9 coming out of Berkeley and MIT, with the work of a small group that gathered in Napa, Hank among them, determining that for the moment germline is not something we're ready for till we've thought about it more, with the help of a gathering for an international summit that also agreed that we're not ready for germline. Now this is, by the way, the summit organizers, not the national academies here, the UK, or in China. But we're not ready for germline until we've really thought it through, until we've had some public buy-in. A consensus committee was started, and that's the one that Hank had referred to earlier. Now, just as an aside, and maybe pick up later, I want to say the editing for germline is probably not going to be through, I've got till 1 o'clock, Hank, so stop flashing that thing at me. It's probably not going to be an embryo, it's probably going to be in gametes, which for some people may solve a few problems, because you don't have to, manipulate embryos, you certainly don't have to destroy embryos. You'd create them from the beginning with just an edited germline. But the fact is, this was really driven by interest from thousands of genetic diseases and lets people have genetically related children without the fear of passing on some really nasty stuff. Now, will it be commonly needed for those diseases? No. In most cases, other alternatives, whether it's adoption, gamete donation, PGD, these things will all work, and they're all going to be easier. But there'll be a few isolated cases where those techniques simply don't work. Just like with MRT, there were some cases where these things simply don't work. One example being a parent who's homozygous for Huntington's was one example of it. So we concluded that in very rare circumstances where it's really the only option, where somatic treatment after birth is not a good option. What? What's he doing? Is he sending me text messages?
Yeah, you're fine.
Oh.
I can't get it to stop.
that this should be permitted. And again, this was objected to for the same reasons. I mean, it's like watching a record go around and around, right? We're not going to appreciate children as gifts. They're going to be objects instead of products. I thought the most interesting one was Gil Mylander, who talked about how begetting as opposed to designing is necessary because it's the only way to ensure human dignity, because we don't, dignity requires that we not be the maker of somebody else. And that was actually the argument that caught my eye more than anybody else's. But mostly, something that I think John Robertson had presaged in his book, Children of Choice, is that there really is no need for us to elevate genetics in such a way that we have to make it somehow static and untouchable and unchangeable and have it determine everything about us, which is why it's unchangeable and untouchable, or have it be something that represents God's will for us. I think that, and this is where, in terms of your IP, this is a piece I'm hoping to write sometime very soon. I think that if we look at the empirical evidence over the last 75 years, we're going to find that most of the fears people have raised have not been realized. And that part of our analysis in the future for all these techniques should include some look at the evidence. Not just the fears in theory, but the evidence of whether or not these fears are being realized as against the evidence for the number of people whose health has actually been preserved or improved through the use of the techniques, and move the argument along from this kind of place where it's been spiraling endlessly without any kind of ending. Joseph Fletcher, I think, really said it best when he said that man's a maker and a selector, and the real difference is between accidental reproduction or rationally chosen reproduction. So this was our gift to the world on Valentine's Day, to say that genetics is no longer such a romantic thing that we can't cross the germline and make things better for the future generations. And as my colleague on the committee said, I thought better than any of us said, it's not about designer babies, it's about healthy babies. Thank you very much.
And I was going to thank you for shortening your talk until you started.
I'm actually 6 minutes over. And since I started 7 minutes late, I'm feeling pretty good about that.
I'm also working on all the different alarm sounds that my iPhone will make, so we'll hear many of them. This next
I'm
time.
self-centered enough, I didn't even hear the quacking.
So we've got 7 minutes or so for questions for Alta.
Or conversation rather than me talking. I think people talking to each other is more interesting.
Or throwing tomatoes or other things.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Kim.
I'll let you teach.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I mean, there's so many pieces there that are things that I've been thinking about and writing about, and we'll talk about tomorrow. So that was nice. I have two. They're not really questions; they're comments. One is on the issue of commodification, where I agree with you just in terms of how people think about their babies. Right, the fact that you create them using sperm that you purchase doesn't change sort of the affection that you have for them. But that wasn't the only commodification argument in the context of assisted reproduction. And one of the big ones, of course, was how it commodifies women's bodies
Right.
In ways that I think are still deeply problematic.
Yes.
Particularly when we think about gestational surrogacy and in developing nations. So I feel like you can't lose that piece.
No, in fact, I completely agree with you, and I deliberately left it off because I wanted to look at the issues around genetics. But when it comes to the question of whether or not the introduction of commerce has caused complications in how it is that we hire one another for things that involve our bodies, or how we value one another, like the 5'9" guy, that's both my brothers, by the way, or how you value, right, the woman who has crossed eyes, that's me, by the way, right, are very real, right? So I don't deny those things at all.
Yeah. And then the other one also really quickly, in thinking about the disability critique of sort of all of these issues, again, I don't think it's all just about, are there going to be sufficient services and all that other fun stuff. I think there's fun, that wasn't the right word. But,
Right.
I think there's also this really deep sort of sense of that we continue to fail to appreciate the fullness of a life that is a life of somebody who is living with a disability. And that, I think, again, continues to be an issue, right? So when we talk about, we want to have healthy children and not unhealthy children, the idea of what is healthy, what is normal, those things I think we're still very much struggling with and haven't gone anywhere.
And I think if we were to agree that we want to do more empirical work on the degree to which these things have become problems and in precisely which ways, that would be a step forward too. Instead of just raising it and then going, it might be out there, let's find out what's out there. I agree with you. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can barely see way in the back.
Hi. So I think one of the reasons why the lay public is focused so much on genetic determinism is this belief that there are some aspects of the self that are not subject to change. They're essentially immutable, such that if you were to change them, the self would be something different. And for a number of reasons, I think that that's probably wrong. So I realize this is more of a philosophy than a bio law question, but are there really any aspects of the self that are immutable, or are we just constantly subject to change? Therefore, the public should just get over the idea that changing their genes is going to change who they are any more than reading a book is going to change.
It's a perfect example of something where I don't want to answer. I want to just let other people talk about it.
But let me interrupt with a technicality. First, I should have commented that we are taking, so take that into account and what you decide to say and whether you'll ever be nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court. But second, we don't have microphones for people in the audience.
So you need to repeat the comments.
But you can warp it any way you want, especially if it's Jake's.
And people should then identify themselves as well. So this had been Kim, I didn't catch your last name. Mutcherson. And this was Jake. Jake Churko had said, some of the reason people may be thinking about genetic determinism still is because there's a belief there's something about us that's immutable, and if changed, changes our identity in some kind of way. And is there such a thing, right? Do we know? And then I said, as you know, I have no idea, and that's a good point for other people to discuss. Yeah.
This is June Carbone. So one of the questions I have about all of this is the things we fairly notice. So as increasing numbers of young women have babies in their 30s as opposed to their 20s, and IVF becomes more common, the issue, you're going through PGD anyway, do you choose on basis of sex? When you implant two, why not a boy and a girl? To the point where we routinize. I'm not saying whether it's bad or good, but instead of a parade of horribles, how do you see the shaping of routine decisions, the cumulatively
So for the sake of the tape, June Carbone was asking whether or not things that are more routinized, for example, when women are now having babies later, have PGD added as one of the routine parts of having a late in life birth, now are now given an opportunity to do things like make choices about traits that wouldn't have been enough to justify doing IVF in and of itself, but now it's an easy add-on. Actually, I think this is exactly where we needed to go, because when PGD came around, there was this kind of jump to the idea that everybody was going to do PGD because everybody was going to want to select. And I thought, that is insane. Sex is so much more fun and cheap. And so why would you go through IVF just to, you know, have PGD for a trivial trait? But yes, if it's already there. But that's why we desperately need people who are economists working in bioethics, because that's how they think. That's the kind of thing that they would look at. What's the trend in the use of IVF? And what's the actual kind of marginal cost and difficulty of selection? How many people make enough embryos that they'd want to discard any number of them? How many people really care about male versus female until they've already got kids and are looking at family balancing, which turns out in the United States to be the primary use for sex selection? And then how many people have kids already when they do the IVF, so that, you know, they think in this kind of empirical way that would give us a much better handle on the scale of use. And that should affect how we think about the social implications. Instead of jumping from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 5 seconds and go, if it's there, then everybody will use it and all of society is affected, let's look at a more subtle way. Who's going to use it? How many? Are they all distributed evenly? Or are they in certain parts of society? So you could look at kind of clumps, geographic, racial, economic, whatever will be used, and then look more closely at this kind of social implications. I think that would be a real advance in bioethics and take us to the next step.
One more short question and answer.
Yeah.
Emily Murphy. It's a really interesting, bigger thesis, especially for those of us who are starting out. So what's our role in this? Do we write papers that identify fears for technologies that we think are on the horizon and wait for the economists to follow up? Or are we sort of making the grooves deeper in the same record and is that not helpful? And I worry, I don't want to write things that are not helpful. I don't want to write things that are inflammatory. But I wonder how much of there's still value in speculating the fears and the parade of horribles and all the things that law people are good at, because it helps give the economists sort of subjects to
Right.
like then they know what the parameters are
Right.
for how they should assess it as a follow-up. But it needs to be that dynamic exchange.
Right.
I love that.
So the question for the tape was basically, how do you know what to work on? Is it to kind of identify future fears and let somebody else follow up with whether or not they're realized, or go back to the old ones and ask what happened? I don't think there's one way to do this. First of all, you said you don't want to write anything useless. That's what most of us do in academics. So please don't dismiss that as a goal in life. But to the extent you want to do something useful, some people will write about fears, and something really useful will be saying, here's what I think is a plan for trying to monitor this and test it on an ongoing basis, so that we learn while it's happening. Other people may want to go back and reanalyze what's been going on in the past in order to develop hypotheses about what might happen in the future, which will help. So there's lots of different ways you can do it, and nobody should feel obligated to do it any one way. My pitch here entirely is this. Bioethics, for a very long time in a lot of these areas, has been the subject of repeated arguments and claims that are based on speculation, particularly about things that are scary. And it is now time for us to see whether or not those things are real, because they have actually stopped certain technologies from moving forward. They've had an objective effect on the outcomes of births and of people's health in their adult lives, and we need to be sure about what we're trading off when we say some things are too scary or dangerous to be permitted. Thanks very much.
Thank you.